President Lyndon Johnson was born on a farm in rural Texas. While Johnson came from a prosperous family with ancestors among the Texas elite, he was haunted by the severe poverty that working-class families suffered during the Great Depression. He recounted that his memories of the destitute and impoverished people forged his determination that the nation should not rest while so many of its citizens went cold and hungry. He explained that this resolve inspired him to work for what he called a Great Society. The Great Society laid out by Johnson and fellow Democrats was in large part similar to the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt and had two main initiatives: the elimination of poverty and the defeat of racial injustice. While Republicans had battled against social reform throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, the Democratic landslide in the elections of 1964 created the perfect playing field for Johnson to lay the groundwork for the Great Society. Emboldened by such a mandate, Johnson declared war on poverty and carried his plans forward. The war on poverty began with a large bill called the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. This landmark legislation created 11 major federal programs designed to combat economic difficulty in the nation. This law created Jobs Corps, one of its best-known programs. A vocational training program for underprivileged youth, Jobs Corps offers free education and training in many vocational fields at residential centers throughout the country. Another program, the Neighborhood Youth Corps, provided work and training for young people from impoverished families in poorer neighborhoods. The Volunteers in Service to America program, or VISTA, recruits and trains volunteers and then refers them to state and local agencies to assist in the elimination of poverty, much like the Peace Corps. The legislation also authorized the Economic Opportunity Council, which launched independent groups to improve the economic environment in struggling communities. Other programs in the Economic Opportunity Act featured similar federal aid programs designed to combat poverty. In addition to helping adults find employment, Johnson's view of the Great Society involved the eradication of hunger. Johnson believed that no American should go without, while so many enjoyed excess. In 1964, Congress passed the Food Stamp Act, giving legislative authority to the food stamp program. The food stamp program had been used periodically in the past during times of crisis, but this act made its existence permanent. The program distributes funds to low-income families to purchase food, food products, and dietary staples in supermarkets around the country. Later, the act would be reworked and rewritten, but the goal to eliminate hunger among those in need has never been challenged. Johnson escalated the war on poverty to include the housing market by signing the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1965. This law expanded funding to build more federal housing units and to make application for federal housing easier for those in need. It created new programs to subsidize housing for the elderly and the disabled, and granted home improvement funds to poorer homeowners so that they could improve their properties. The Housing and Urban Development Act provided low-cost mortgages to veterans, and it gave funds to municipal governments to expand water and sewage facilities and to construct community centers in poorer neighborhoods. Under this legislation, people in need were able to acquire and keep homes. The retired and elderly could afford to rent a home and maintain their independence. People with disabilities who were unable to work could afford a place to live. Veterans and military personnel could get a head start on home ownership after years of public service. Shortly after this bill was passed, Johnson signed legislation that created the Department of Housing and Urban Development, a cabinet-level agency within the executive branch with its own secretary, to develop and execute policies on housing and urban problems. Johnson's plans for the Great Society included providing equal opportunity in education so that future generations of Americans would be able to develop their skills and interests into careers and services, prosper personally, and strengthen the nation as a result. So in 1965, Congress also passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act at Johnson's request. It is the most important education act in the Great Society program, consisting of 6 different provisions called titles. The first title, Title I, distributes federal aid to schools and school districts in low socioeconomic areas. Other titles provided funding to supplement educational resources such as libraries and alternative education centers. The Act also provided for the Head Start program, a preschool education program for underprivileged children from families in need. These increased federal funds were aimed at increasing student performance and retention rates. The funds targeted schools that were underperforming due to revenue and budgetary difficulties. Johnson believed that fair education was the one factor that would allow the poorest Americans, particularly those in rural areas, to escape poverty and improve their economic prospects. He also felt that lack of education was the #1 cause of poverty and bigotry in the nation. Johnson knew that supplying Americans with the means to educate themselves would lay the foundation for a great society that would endure.